March 1945. A small German town on the edge of the Rhine. The air still smells of smoke and damp stone. Roofs are broken. Windows are boarded with scraps of wood torn from bombed homes. The war has not ended here yet, but it is close. Along a narrow street, a group of German children stands silently. Their coats are too thin for the cold. Their faces are sharp with hunger. For years, they were taught to laugh at America, a nation of jazz, excess, and softness. A people who could not endure sacrifice. A culture that would collapse once the war became hard. Then the trucks arrive. Olive-drab vehicles roll in, engines steady, unhurried. American soldiers climb down. They sit on crates. They open tins. Meat, bread, chocolate, coffee. The smell drifts across the street. The children watch as soldiers eat without counting bites, without fear of tomorrow's ration. Some soldiers tear open wrappers and quietly hold them out. In that moment, the laughter taught in classrooms fades. Something far more unsettling takes its place. And to understand why this moment mattered, the story must begin years earlier, long before American boots reached German soil. Long before American soldiers reached German towns, German children had already been mobilized for war, mentally, emotionally, and ideologically. From the earliest years of the Third Reich, childhood in Germany was not considered a private phase of life. It was a state project. By the mid-1930s, schools, youth organizations, textbooks, and even children's games had been reshaped to serve a single purpose: preparing the next generation to believe, obey, and endure. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls became nearly universal. By 1939, membership was effectively mandatory. Children learned discipline, physical endurance, and loyalty to the state. But just as important, they learned who to despise. America occupied a special place in Nazi propaganda. German children were taught that the United States was not a serious civilization. It was described as a nation without history, without culture, without depth. Films, posters, and lessons portrayed Americans as materialistic, racially mixed, obsessed with entertainment, and incapable of sacrifice. Jazz music associated with America was mocked as chaotic and degenerate. Hollywood films were dismissed as shallow illusions masking weakness. This messaging was not subtle. It was repetitive, and it worked. By the early years of the war, many German children genuinely believed that Americans were spoiled and soft. They believed Americans could not endure hunger, could not tolerate discipline, could not fight a long, grinding war against a hardened, obedient society like Germany's. Early events seemed to confirm this belief. In 1940 and 1941, Germany crushed Poland, France, the Low Countries. Europe fell quickly. Britain stood alone. The United States, still neutral, appeared distant and hesitant. Even after America entered the war in December 1941, it took time before large numbers of U.S. soldiers appeared in Europe. During those years, German children continued to absorb a carefully controlled narrative. The war was presented as difficult but righteous. Sacrifice was framed as proof of strength. Hunger, cold, and shortages were portrayed as honorable burdens that only superior peoples could bear. Meanwhile, American abundance became a propaganda weapon turned on its head. Nazi messaging emphasized that Americans lived in excess, that they wasted food, that they relied on machines and comforts instead of discipline. German children were encouraged to see their own hunger as moral superiority. They were told that Americans could never survive such conditions. As the war dragged on, this belief hardened into identity. By 1942 and 1943, Germany's situation worsened. Allied bombing intensified. Fathers disappeared to the front. Older brothers stopped writing home. Cities burned. Food became scarcer. Rations were cut again and again. Children stood in long lines with ration cards that delivered less each month. Yet the propaganda did not change its tone. Teachers continued to insist that American soldiers were weak. Newspapers claimed that U.S. troops depended entirely on machines and supplies, and would collapse once Germany disrupted them. Children were taught to laugh at American culture not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was supposedly fragile. This psychological foundation mattered deeply, because when hunger becomes part of daily life, belief becomes a survival tool. For German children, the idea that Americans could not endure scarcity helped justify their own suffering. It gave meaning to empty stomachs and bombed homes. But by late 1943, cracks began to appear. Rumors spread quietly, whispers from the front, stories from soldiers on leave, mentions of American convoys that never seemed to end, of enemy troops who were not starving, of factories that produced endlessly. These rumors were dangerous. They contradicted everything children had been taught. And as the war moved closer to Germany's borders, those rumors were about to be replaced by something far more powerful than words. They were about to be replaced by sight. By 1944, the war had transformed daily life in Germany into a slow struggle against exhaustion and scarcity. For children, hunger was no longer an exception, it was routine. Food rationing had existed since the first months of the war, but by its later years the system was stretched to the breaking point. Allied bombing had damaged rail networks, warehouses, and food processing facilities. Farms faced labor shortages as men were drafted and fuel was redirected to the military. Harvests declined. Deliveries failed to arrive on time. Rations were reduced quietly, then openly. By the winter of 1944, German civilian calorie intake had fallen well below pre-war levels. Children felt it first. Bread was thinner. Meat was rare. Butter and sugar became memories rather than staples. School lunches, once a symbol of national care, were reduced or eliminated altogether. Hunger shaped every hour of the day. At the same time, the physical environment collapsed around them. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden had already suffered catastrophic bombing. Smaller towns followed. Children learned to recognize the sound of incoming aircraft before they learned complex arithmetic. Cellars replaced bedrooms. Rubble replaced playgrounds. Yet even as German society strained under the weight of total war, the state demanded more from its youth. Teenagers were pulled from classrooms to work in factories, clear debris, or assist anti-aircraft units. Younger children were trained to report defeatist talk and maintain morale at home. What they were not told was how profoundly different the American war effort looked on the other side of the front. The United States approached war as an industrial problem. From the moment it entered the conflict, American planners focused on scale, efficiency, and sustainment. Factories were reorganized. Civilian industries converted to military production. Food processing, packaging, and preservation became part of the war machine. American soldiers were fed deliberately and scientifically. By the mid-war years, the U.S. Army had developed standardized rations designed to deliver calories, protein, and morale under any conditions. K rations for mobile troops, C rations for sustained combat. Each package contained meat, bread or crackers, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. These were not luxuries. They were tools. Behind those rations stood a logistics system without precedent. The United States produced more food than it consumed. American farms, protected from bombing and supplied with fuel and machinery, generated surpluses that could be shipped overseas. Refrigeration, canning, and dehydration extended shelf life. Massive ports in Britain and France processed endless cargo. Truck convoys, like the Red Ball Express, moved supplies forward day and night. This system did not merely support American soldiers. It defined how they fought. U.S. military doctrine assumed that troops would remain well-fed even under pressure. Energy, mobility, and endurance were treated as strategic assets. Hunger was considered a failure of planning, not a test of character. German commanders noticed this difference long before German civilians did. Captured documents and after-action reports repeatedly commented on American supply depth. Even when U.S. units suffered tactical setbacks, replacements arrived quickly. Equipment losses were made good. Food continued to flow. German soldiers on the Western Front began to realize that disrupting American logistics was far harder than propaganda suggested. Still, inside Germany, children were shielded from these realities. Newspapers avoided discussing enemy supply levels. Radio broadcasts focused on sacrifice and resilience. American abundance was dismissed as wasteful excess that would eventually collapse under its own weight. But as Allied armies broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, and as American troops pushed eastward through France and into the German borderlands, the distance between belief and reality narrowed rapidly. For German children, the war was no longer an abstraction carried by radio voices and classroom slogans. It was moving closer, and when it arrived, it would not come first with gunfire, but with something far more disorienting. Food. For German children in the final years of the war, hunger was not described as suffering. It was described as duty. They learned to accept empty plates without complaint. School lessons framed scarcity as proof of moral strength. Teachers spoke of sacrifice as a virtue that separated Germans from their enemies. Children repeated these ideas at home, often to reassure exhausted parents. Hunger became normal, so normal that many children stopped expecting fullness at all. This normalization mattered. When American soldiers finally appeared in German towns, children did not see enemies first. They saw something incomprehensible. Men who were not thin, faces that were not hollow, soldiers who sat and ate without urgency, without counting bites, without fear of the next day's ration. To a child raised in scarcity, abundance feels unreal. Accounts from civilian diaries describe children staring silently at American troops opening ration tins. The smell alone was overwhelming: meat, coffee, sugar. Items that had vanished from German households years earlier. Some children laughed nervously. Others did not speak at all. What they were seeing contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness. Hunger had been framed as a test of endurance. But here were men who had endured war without it. That realization was unsettling. Nazi propaganda had invested heavily in shaping how children viewed America. It was not enough to portray the enemy as dangerous. The enemy had to be morally inferior. American culture was ridiculed as shallow. Consumption was portrayed as decadence. Comfort was framed as cowardice. German children were encouraged to see their own deprivation as evidence of strength and discipline. But propaganda depends on distance. As long as America remained far away, it could be imagined however the state wished. Once American soldiers stood in German streets, propaganda lost its power. Children noticed details adults tried to ignore. Clean boots, full packs, cigarettes offered casually, chocolate handed out without ceremony. The enemy did not look desperate. He did not look exhausted. He did not look weak. This was not the image they had memorized. The laughter faded quickly, not because American culture was suddenly admired, but because it was no longer abstract. It had weight, smell, texture. It existed in front of them, undeniable. And for children trained to believe absolutely, this moment created confusion that words could not resolve. What German children witnessed was not generosity alone. It was logistics made visible. The ability of American soldiers to eat well in enemy territory was not accidental. It was the result of planning that treated supply as a form of power. Food sustained morale, health, and discipline. It allowed soldiers to move faster, think clearer, and endure longer. German children did not understand convoy systems or ration science, but they understood contrast. They knew hunger, and they could see its absence. In that silent comparison, the war's outcome began to feel inevitable. Not because of bombs or tanks, but because one side could feed its people even at the front. And once that understanding settled in, it changed how the war was perceived, not just by commanders and soldiers, but by the youngest witnesses standing quietly on shattered streets. That shift would deepen as encounters multiplied, and as children began to see not just how Americans ate, but how they behaved. For years, German children had been warned about what American soldiers would do once they arrived. Stories circulated in classrooms and shelters, tales of cruelty, chaos, and revenge. Fear was meant to harden young minds, preparing them to resist or at least endure occupation. But fear depends on imagination. When American troops entered towns and villages in 1944 and 1945, many children did not see monsters. They saw men who spoke loudly, laughed openly, and moved with confidence rather than desperation. Soldiers who followed rules. Soldiers who waited their turn. Soldiers who did not seize food from civilians already starving. This contradiction unsettled the emotional framework children had been given. Reports from German civilian authorities noted that children often approached American soldiers first, not out of defiance but curiosity. They watched how Americans treated prisoners, how they distributed food under supervision, how discipline was enforced among their own ranks. The enemy no longer fit the shape fear had given him. Fear did not disappear immediately, but it changed. It became quieter, more uncertain, less useful. American abundance could have been displayed brutally. It was not. U.S. military policy towards civilians emphasized order, control, and restraint. Soldiers were instructed not to loot. Food distribution, when it occurred, followed procedures. Children were not encouraged to swarm troops. Kindness was regulated but visible. For German children, this restraint mattered. They had been told that strength revealed itself through harshness, that mercy was weakness. Yet here was a victorious army that did not need to starve civilians to assert dominance. The moral lesson was subtle but powerful. Power did not require cruelty to be real. Children noticed this long before adults were willing to acknowledge it. In diaries and post-war interviews, many later recalled that their first realization the war was truly lost came not from surrender announcements, but from watching American soldiers eat calmly while they themselves were hungry. That contrast carried weight no speech could match. American culture arrived in Germany not through movies or music, but through logistics. Chewing gum, chocolate bars, tins of meat, coffee brewed in the open air. These were small items, but to children raised in scarcity they felt enormous. They were symbols of a system that produced more than it consumed. German children had been taught that such abundance was wasteful, that it would lead to collapse. But collapse did not come. The war continued. The supplies kept coming. This was the final break. The belief that sacrifice alone determined strength could not survive direct comparison. Children began to understand, often without words, that modern war was no longer won by endurance alone. It was won by systems. And as American troops pushed deeper into Germany, this understanding spread quietly, town by town, street by street. By the time the decisive moments arrived, the final crossings, the surrenders, the occupation, the psychological turning point for many German children had already passed. They had seen the future arrive with full stomachs. By the early months of 1945, the Western Front no longer felt distant to German civilians. It was present, audible, visible, inevitable. American forces crossed the German border in multiple sectors following the collapse of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Towns that had never seen foreign soldiers now heard the low rumble of engines and artillery moving closer each day. For children, the front was no longer something marked on maps in classrooms. It was the sound that woke them before dawn. When U.S. units entered these towns, they did so methodically. Streets were secured. Buildings were searched. Curfews were imposed. And then, almost immediately, the routines of an army at rest began to appear. Soldiers cooked. They sat on overturned crates, vehicle hoods, broken steps. Mess kits opened. Tins were heated. Coffee was brewed openly, its smell drifting through streets where civilians had not tasted it in years. For German children watching from doorways and windows, this moment carried a weight that combat never had. Bombing was familiar. Hunger was familiar. Fear was familiar. But this calm display of sustenance in the heart of a collapsing nation was new. American soldiers did not rush meals. They did not hide food. They did not appear anxious about the next supply. Even as fighting continued nearby, the system behind them remained intact. Children noticed how casually food was handled, how wrappers were discarded, how rations were shared between soldiers without concern, how officers ate the same food as enlisted men. This was not desperation. It was confidence. In some towns, military police organized limited food distribution for civilians once order was established. Bread, soup, occasionally canned goods. Children lined up quietly, clutching containers. They had learned discipline from scarcity. But what unsettled them most was not receiving food. It was seeing that American soldiers had more than they needed. German diaries from this period describe children counting how many tins a single soldier carried, watching vehicles unload supplies not immediately consumed, observing that even after days of movement, Americans still ate well. For children raised to believe that abundance bred weakness, this reality was destabilizing. The moment was not loud. There were no speeches, no announcements, just observation, and observation was enough. As American columns continued their advance, these scenes repeated themselves again and again. Town after town, village after village. Each encounter reinforced the same truth. This was not an army scraping by. This was an army sustained. And as children absorbed that fact, something deeper began to shift. Not just how they viewed the enemy, but how they understood the war itself. That understanding would sharpen as the final weeks unfolded. As March turned into April, the contrast that German children had first glimpsed became impossible to ignore. American forces did not slow. They did not pause to consolidate fragile gains. They moved with a rhythm that felt mechanical. Bridges secured, roads cleared, supply columns rolling forward almost immediately behind the front line. Even as resistance collapsed unevenly, the structure remained intact. For children watching from the margins, the message was unmistakable. This was not a war effort driven by desperation. It was driven by momentum. In many towns, German civil defense systems had already disintegrated by the time American troops arrived. Local officials fled or surrendered. Schools were closed. Air raid sirens fell silent, not because danger had passed, but because there was no longer anyone left to operate them. And yet, American routines continued as if untouched by chaos. Soldiers washed, shaved, ate regularly. Vehicles were serviced. Equipment was repaired on site. Field kitchens appeared where German ones had long vanished. Children noticed how American soldiers seemed prepared not just to fight, but to stay. This permanence mattered. For years, German children had been told that the enemy would exhaust himself, that Americans, addicted to comfort, would falter once faced with hardship. Instead, hardship seemed absorbed, processed, and neutralized by an invisible system that never stopped feeding men and machines. Hunger sharpened this realization. By April 1945, food shortages in Germany were severe. In many areas, children survived on thin soups, ersatz bread, and whatever could be scavenged from ruined gardens. Malnutrition was visible. Weight loss, fatigue, illness, growth stunted by months of deprivation. Against this background, the sight of well-fed American soldiers was not just shocking. It was defining. Some children later recalled that this was the exact moment they understood the war was lost. Not when the flag came down, not when the radio announced surrender, but when they saw that the enemy had not paid the same price in hunger. This understanding spread quietly among children, often unspoken. There was no language for it, only observation. In certain towns, American soldiers began limited interactions with children under supervision. Chocolate was offered, gum exchanged, not as propaganda but as routine behavior from men who had enough to give. These small acts carried enormous psychological weight. They exposed the final failure of Nazi messaging. Sacrifice alone had not made Germany stronger. Endurance alone had not determined victory. The world the children had been promised, a world where suffering proved superiority, collapsed under the simplest evidence. Full stomachs. By the time Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, many children had already reached their own conclusions. They had watched an enemy arrive not starving, not broken, not cruel, but sustained. And in that quiet realization, the war ended for them before it ended on paper. What followed would shape their lives long after the fighting stopped. The fighting ended, but the contrast did not. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, American forces transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties across large sections of the country. For German children, this shift marked the beginning of a new and deeply confusing phase of life. Hunger did not disappear with the ceasefire. In many regions, it worsened. The German economy was shattered. Transportation networks lay in ruins. Fields had gone unplanted or untended. Warehouses were empty. The rationing system, already strained, now struggled to function at all. Children continued to queue for food that arrived late or not at all. American soldiers, however, remained fed. U.S. Army supply lines did not collapse with victory. They adapted. Field kitchens continued operating. Rations remained standardized. Medical care was expanded. Even as occupation responsibilities grew, the system that had sustained American forces through combat sustained them through peace. This reality was impossible for German children to ignore. In many occupied areas, U.S. authorities began assessing civilian conditions almost immediately. Military government units recorded malnutrition levels, especially among children. Schools, when reopened, reported widespread hunger and fatigue. In response, American policy shifted toward stabilization rather than punishment. Food relief became a tool of control and recovery. Initially limited by concerns over supply and political optics, American-led relief efforts expanded as the scale of civilian need became undeniable. Soup kitchens were established. School feeding programs resumed under Allied supervision. International aid organizations, supported by American logistics, began distributing supplies. Children were often the first recipients. For many, the first warm, filling meal they received after the war came from an American-run facility. The memory of these meals, simple, structured, sufficient, left a lasting impression. Not because they were generous, but because they were reliable. The psychological effect of this stability cannot be overstated. Children who had grown up in constant uncertainty now encountered a system that functioned predictably. Meals came at set times. Portions were consistent. Rules were enforced calmly. This predictability, after years of chaos, felt transformative. It also reinforced the lesson already learned during the war's final weeks. Power was not loud. It was organized. As German children adjusted to occupation life, they began to reinterpret their wartime experiences. The laughter once directed at American culture seemed distant, almost absurd. The idea that comfort and discipline were opposites no longer made sense. Yet this reassessment did not happen overnight. Hunger still hurt. Ruins still surrounded them. Parents still struggled. But a new framework was forming, one based not on ideology, but on lived experience. And as months passed, that experience deepened. As occupation settled into routine, German children began to accumulate memories that would stay with them long after the war faded from headlines. These were not dramatic moments. There were no parades or speeches. Instead, memory formed around small, repeated observations. American soldiers patrolling the same streets each day. Trucks arriving on schedule. Kitchens operating even when electricity failed. Rules enforced without shouting. For children raised in an environment where authority had been loud, absolute, and increasingly chaotic, this quieter form of control felt unfamiliar. Postwar interviews and memoirs often returned to the same detail: food. Children remembered the taste of unfamiliar items: peanut butter, powdered milk, canned meat. They remembered chewing gum that lasted longer than expected. Chocolate that did not need to be saved for a special occasion. Coffee that adults drank openly, without hiding it from ration inspectors. These experiences reshaped how the war was remembered. Years later, many Germans who had been children in 1945 recalled that their understanding of defeat was not defined by flags or declarations. It was defined by contrast, by the realization that the enemy had not been reduced to the same suffering, that America had fought a total war without exhausting its people in the same way. This realization influenced how a generation viewed authority, ideology, and power. The American presence did not erase trauma. Bombing memories persisted. Losses remained. But the occupation introduced a different model of strength, one rooted in organization, predictability, and material capacity rather than sacrifice alone. For some children, this created admiration. For others, resentment. But for almost all, it created clarity. The war they had been promised was not the war that had been fought. Teachers' words had collapsed under evidence. Propaganda had dissolved under observation. The laughter once encouraged at American culture became a marker of innocence lost. In the years that followed, many of these children grew into adults who rebuilt Germany under entirely different assumptions. Food security became a priority. Industrial planning was emphasized. Stability replaced spectacle. The memory of hunger, and of watching well-fed foreign soldiers walk through ruined streets, remained a quiet reference point. It was not discussed often. It did not need to be. It had already taught its lesson. And as time passed, that lesson expanded beyond Germany itself, becoming part of a larger understanding of how modern wars are truly won. That understanding invites reflection. War is often remembered through its violence, through battles, explosions, and lines drawn on maps. But for those who live through it as children, memory forms differently. It settles around routine, around absence, around the quiet details that shape daily survival. For German children in 1945, the decisive moment of the war was not always marked by surrender papers or marching armies. It arrived earlier and more softly. It arrived in the form of full mess tins, regular meals, and soldiers who did not seem hungry. That contrast revealed something fundamental about modern warfare. Victory was no longer determined by endurance alone. Hunger did not prove strength. Suffering did not guarantee superiority. The war was decided by systems, by the ability to organize, to produce, to sustain life even while destroying an enemy's capacity to fight. American power, as these children witnessed it, did not announce itself through cruelty. It appeared through stability, through logistics that functioned under pressure, through a society capable of feeding its soldiers without starving its civilians. This realization reshaped a generation's understanding of authority and sacrifice. It replaced ideology with evidence. It turned abstract enemies into observable realities. For many of those children, the memory endured long after rubble was cleared and new buildings rose. It remained as a quiet measure of truth, that strength is not proven by how much suffering a nation can endure, but by how well it can prevent it. In that sense, the laughter faded not because American culture was mocked too soon, but because reality arrived, undeniable and well-fed. And in that arrival, history taught one of its most lasting lessons.